There are moments in our lives when we must confront the difficult reality of letting go of someone, even when our hearts resist. Yet in these moments we are often faced with the quiet but firm whisper of divine guidance. Today, let us reflect on the 3 signs that God may be telling us to release someone from our lives, not out of bitterness or despair, but out of the wisdom of His grace. When we consider the nature of divine guidance, one of the clearest indicators that God may be asking us to release someone from our lives is the profound sense of unrest that takes root within us. Peace is often referred to as a fruit of the Spirit, a gift that allows our hearts to be settled and aligned with God's will. It is a deep, internal sense of well-being that transcends circumstances and holds us steady through the storms of life. This peace is not a mere absence of conflict, but a quiet assurance that no matter the external chaos, we are exactly where we need to be, in perfect alignment with divine purpose. When this peace begins to dissipate and instead an overwhelming sense of unrest takes over, it becomes a crucial sign that something has shifted. Our hearts are not at ease, and the spirit feels disquieted. This unrest may not always manifest as an acute sense of anxiety, but rather as a subtle, gnawing discomfort that lingers and refuses to be ignored. Something much, much worse. It is the kind of feeling that grows steadily over time, a whisper from within that nudges us to reconsider the situation we find ourselves in. The longer we ignore this inner stirring, the louder it becomes, sometimes leading to a restless spirit that affects not only our emotional state, but also our physical and mental well-being. In many instances, the people we are connected with may not actively cause this unrest. It is not a reflection of their personal qualities or actions, but rather an indication that the relationship has reached a crossroads. Perhaps the dynamics have shifted, or perhaps the individual is no longer serving the higher purpose that God has for our lives. Relationships are meant to help us grow, to shape us into the people God intends for us to become. When a relationship no longer contributes positively to our growth, when it starts to hinder our development, that inner peace begins to erode, replaced by a quiet unease. This unrest may also be linked to our spiritual connection. As believers, we are called to walk in step with the Holy Spirit, to allow His presence to guide and direct our choices. When we are in the company of those who are not aligned with our faith or whose actions do not reflect the values we hold dear, we may find that our peace is disrupted. It may be a subtle shift at first, a gentle unease that we can't quite place, but over time it becomes evident that this disturbance is a signal that God is urging us to reconsider the influence this person has in our life. The unrest that emerges may also serve as a catalyst for deeper self-examination. It forces us to confront our emotions, our needs, and our priorities. In moments of unrest, we often become more aware of what we truly need from our relationships and what we are willing to tolerate. If we are not experiencing peace, it may be an invitation from God to reflect on whether we are holding on to something that is no longer in alignment with our greater purpose. As unsettling as it may be, this inner disquiet is a profound act of divine love. God is not punishing us, but gently guiding us toward a better way, a way that restores our peace and aligns us more closely with His will. When peace is replaced with unrest, we are called not to ignore it, but to listen carefully, seeking God's wisdom in discerning the necessary steps forward. By surrendering to His guidance, we open ourselves to healing and growth, trusting that His plan for our lives is greater than any temporary discomfort. Love, in its truest form, is meant to be a reciprocal and nurturing force, a connection between two people where both parties give and receive in equal measure. In the relationships that God intends for us, love is not one-sided. It is a dynamic exchange that fosters mutual growth, support, and encouragement. However, when love becomes one-sided, when we find ourselves continuously giving without receiving in return, it can be an undeniable sign that God is urging us to reconsider our connection with a particular person. Over time, the imbalance in a relationship can become increasingly evident. We may find ourselves constantly sacrificing for the other person, investing emotional energy, time, and resources, only to see little to no effort in return. At first, this may feel like an act of love or a form of selflessness. After all, many of us are taught to love unconditionally, to offer without expecting anything in return. But while unconditional love is indeed a beautiful virtue, it must also be grounded in wisdom. True love, as modeled by Christ, is not about constant sacrifice without reciprocity. It is about a partnership where both individuals are empowered to give and receive freely, supporting one another in their individual and shared journeys. When one person is constantly giving without any signs of the other person investing or reciprocating, there comes a point where the giver begins to feel drained, emotionally depleted, and possibly even resentful. This is not the way God designed relationships to be. Relationships are meant to be sources of strength and encouragement, not avenues of exhaustion and frustration. God calls us to walk in relationships that build us up, where we find mutual respect, understanding, and love. When love becomes one-sided, it is not only detrimental to the individual who is doing all the giving, but it also stunts the growth of the person who is receiving without giving in return. Both individuals are missing out on the potential for true, mutual connection. It is essential to understand that this imbalance is not always intentional. The person who is receiving may not be fully aware of the lack of reciprocity, or they may be incapable of offering the same level of love due to their own struggles, wounds, or limitations. Nevertheless, the absence of mutual love still leaves a mark on the relationship. Over time, the giver may feel more like a caretaker or a provider than a partner. And this can erode the bond that once existed. The love that was once nurturing may begin to feel more like an obligation, and what was once a relationship built on connection may start to feel like a transaction. In such situations, God's guidance is clear. It may be time to release the other person in order to allow both individuals the space to grow. This does not mean we abandon them, but rather that we allow ourselves the freedom to prioritize our own well-being, while also allowing them the chance to mature in their own time. God's love is abundant, and He desires for us to experience relationships that reflect His grace and mercy. When love becomes one-sided, it is a gentle reminder that we are called to seek relationships that enrich both our lives and the lives of those we care for. Relationships that foster mutual growth, understanding, and love. Letting go of a one-sided relationship is not an act of failure, but an act of wisdom. It is a recognition that love, in its truest form, is meant to be shared. By stepping away, we make space for healthier connections to form, where both parties can contribute to the flourishing of each other's lives. As painful as it may seem, this is not a sign of defeat, but rather a recognition that God has something greater in store for us, something that honors our worth and enables us to love more freely and fully. In the journey of life, growth is one of the central purposes for which we were created. God's will for us is that we continually evolve spiritually, emotionally, and intellectually, becoming more of the person He designed us to be. Growth allows us to fulfill our purpose and live in alignment with the potential He has instilled within us. It's through relationships, experiences, and personal challenges that we often encounter the conditions necessary for growth. But there are times when a relationship or a connection can act as a hindrance, stifling the very development that God intends for us. When growth is stunted, it becomes a glaring sign that something is out of alignment, and God may be signaling that it is time to step away. Often, we can feel this stunted growth deep within us, a sense of stagnation, a feeling of being stuck. We may find ourselves going in circles, unable to break free from unhealthy patterns, or unable to move forward in life, because a particular relationship is keeping us bound. Whether it is a toxic dynamic, an unhealthy attachment, or a constant cycle of frustration, we begin to realize that no matter how hard we try, progress feels impossible. Our dreams, aspirations, and inner growth seem to be out of reach, obscured by the weight of this connection. One of the most crucial aspects of spiritual and personal growth is the ability to reflect on who we are becoming in the context of our relationships. If we notice that a relationship continually brings us back to old habits, prevents us from reaching for new opportunities, or pulls us into a place of negativity, then the growth we once hoped for might be under threat. Stunted growth is not just a matter of feeling emotionally drained, but it can also manifest in physical or mental exhaustion. We become weary not because we are pursuing growth, but because we are being held in place by something or someone that does not encourage us to move forward. This stagnation can also be linked to a lack of support or understanding from the other person. When we are surrounded by individuals who cannot or will not encourage our growth, who fail to challenge us or help us reach our potential, we may find ourselves trapped in a state of arrested development. Relationships are meant to push us, to help us reflect on who we are and who we are becoming. They should be sources of inspiration, encouragement, and accountability, spurring us onward toward becoming better versions of ourselves. But if a relationship is not serving that purpose, it is often a sign that it has fulfilled its role for the time being, and we may need to release it to move forward. Stunted growth often comes from a place of fear or insecurity. Sometimes we hold on to relationships because we are afraid of the unknown, or we fear that without that connection we will be lost or unable to thrive. But God has created us to be resilient and capable of growth, even in moments of uncertainty. His plan for our lives does not depend on holding on to unhealthy relationships, but on trusting that He will guide us into environments and connections that will foster the flourishing He desires for us. When growth is stunted, it is not a sign that we are failing, but that God is inviting us to step into a new chapter, one where we can truly grow and discover the person He has always intended for us to become. Letting go of a relationship that has stifled our growth can be one of the most painful yet liberating acts of faith. It is an acknowledgement that our purpose and well-being are too precious to be limited by someone or something that prevents us from moving forward. By trusting God and stepping away, we open the door to new opportunities, new relationships, and most importantly, to the deeper growth that will bring us closer to the person He has created us to be. In His wisdom, God calls us to relationships that empower us to reach new heights And when we recognize that a relationship is no longer contributing to our growth, we trust Him to lead us to the next step of our journey. When we consider our emotional well-being, it is important to recognize that God's will for us is to live lives of peace, joy, and spiritual balance. God does not desire for us to be in relationships that cause constant turmoil, emotional distress, or unhealthy attachment. Emotional well-being is deeply connected to the health of our relationships. When we are surrounded by people who contribute to our sense of security, happiness, and inner peace, we are more likely to flourish. Conversely, when a relationship consistently undermines our emotional stability, it can be a clear indication that it is time to reconsider the connection, especially if this emotional imbalance persists over time. Emotional well-being involves much more than simply feeling okay on the surface. It includes a deep sense of inner peace, the ability to process emotions healthily, and the freedom to express ourselves without fear of judgment or harm. In the right relationships, we find safe spaces for vulnerability, understanding, and mutual respect. However, when a relationship consistently triggers negative emotions such as anxiety, resentment, frustration, or confusion, it begins to undermine our ability to find peace within ourselves. The constant emotional strain becomes a heavy burden, affecting not only our mental and spiritual health, but also our physical well-being. It is important to understand that God desires for us to be emotionally well, and this does not mean that we are expected to avoid all challenges or disagreements in our relationships. No relationship is without its difficulties, and even the healthiest partnerships will have their share of trials. However, what distinguishes a relationship that contributes to emotional well-being from one that harms it is the ability to work through challenges in a constructive and supportive manner. When conflict arises, there should be a spirit of reconciliation, understanding, and growth. In unhealthy relationships, however, the conflict may persist without resolution, or it may escalate into something more damaging. Instead of fostering mutual healing, such relationships only exacerbate emotional turmoil, leaving one or both individuals feeling drained, misunderstood, or even unsafe. A significant part of emotional well-being is the capacity to set boundaries and protect our emotional energy. God calls us to be good stewards of ourselves, to honor our emotional needs and not allow them to be violated by others. If a relationship continually disregards these boundaries, or if we find ourselves in a position where our emotional needs are not being met or even acknowledged, it can result in a profound sense of depletion over time. This emotional depletion may leave us feeling empty, as though we are giving endlessly without receiving anything in return. This is not a situation in which God desires us to remain. In fact, He calls us to seek relationships that nurture our emotional health, where there is a balance of giving and receiving, and where both individuals can find fulfillment. In recognizing when our emotional well-being is being compromised, we are also acknowledging the importance of self-care. We must understand that by remaining in a relationship that is emotionally damaging, we are not only harming ourselves, but we may also be preventing the other person from growing or maturing in the way God intends. Often we hold on to relationships because we feel obligated or out of fear of being alone. But God's desire for us is never to stay in situations that leave us emotionally broken. Instead, He calls us to walk in freedom, knowing that in Him we have everything we need to heal, grow, and move forward. Letting go of a relationship that compromises our emotional well-being is not an easy decision, and it may come with feelings of guilt, fear, or uncertainty. However, it is an act of courage and faith. God has designed us to live in peace, and when our emotional health is threatened, it is a sign that He may be calling us to step away, not out of abandonment, but out of His love for us. In this release, we trust that God will restore our emotional well-being and guide us toward relationships that contribute to our flourishing. When we honor our emotional needs, we allow space for healing, growth, and ultimately the deeper joy that God desires for us. Freedom is one of the greatest gifts that God has given us. In Christ we are freed from the bondage of sin, shame, and fear. This freedom allows us to live authentically, pursue our purpose, and grow into the individuals we were created to be. It is not simply a physical freedom, but a spiritual and emotional liberation that aligns us with God's will. In relationships, true freedom is essential. When we are in relationships that empower us to be ourselves, to pursue our dreams, and to grow spiritually and emotionally, we experience the fullness of life. But when relationships begin to restrict or confine us, when they hold us back from living the life God intends for us, it is often a sign that God is calling us to step away. Freedom in a relationship means being able to grow individually, without the constant fear of judgment, restriction, or manipulation. Healthy relationships do not demand conformity to a particular image or expectation. Instead, they allow each person to flourish in their own unique identity. Unfortunately, when we find ourselves in relationships that stifle this freedom, whether through control, manipulation, or emotional dependency, it becomes increasingly difficult to move forward in the direction God has for us. These relationships can feel like chains that weigh us down, preventing us from stepping into the fullness of our potential. God desires for us to be free from all that hinders our growth and purpose. If a relationship consistently limits our ability to grow, whether emotionally, spiritually, or physically, it is a signal that it may be time to release that connection. This is not to say that we abandon the person out of anger or resentment, but rather that we recognize that in order to fully embrace God's calling for our lives, we must be free to move without the burden of unhealthy attachments. When our freedom is compromised in relationships, we are not able to pursue the goals, dreams, and callings that God has placed on our hearts. We may feel trapped, unsure of how to break free, or fearful of stepping into the unknown. But in reality, God is calling us to embrace His freedom and to trust that stepping away from such relationships is a step toward the life He has planned for us. A lack of freedom in a relationship can take the form of emotional or psychological dependence. When we rely too heavily on another person for validation, approval, or self-worth, we risk losing our sense of autonomy and individuality. God calls us to find our identity in Him and not in the opinions or expectations of others. A relationship that encourages dependence rather than mutual support and independence can lead to a loss of personal freedom. This kind of attachment can cause us to compromise our values, ignore our own needs, or make decisions based on fear rather than faith. True freedom allows us to make choices that are aligned with God's will, without the fear of judgment or the need to please others. In relationships where freedom is compromised, we can also find ourselves sacrificing our boundaries in the name of love or affection. God created us with the ability to set healthy boundaries, to protect our emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being. When we find ourselves in relationships that push or disregard these boundaries, We are being called to reclaim our freedom. Letting go of a relationship that compromises our boundaries is not an act of rejection, but an affirmation of our worth and value in God's eyes. It is an acknowledgement that we are worthy of love and respect, and we do not need to sacrifice our freedom to gain someone else's approval. By choosing to step away from relationships that restrict our freedom, we open ourselves to the abundant life that God has for us. In His wisdom, God allows us to grow and flourish in environments that encourage our freedom, helping us become more like Christ. Letting go is not a sign of defeat, but a courageous step toward embracing the life of purpose, peace, and growth that God desires for us. True freedom, both in our relationships and in our spiritual lives, is the key to living a life of fulfillment and peace. And trusting God to guide us into this freedom is the ultimate act of faith. God calls us to live in relationships that offer balance, mutual respect, and growth, but not every relationship is meant to last forever. Sometimes relationships reach their natural conclusion, and we must acknowledge that holding on to them any longer could be detrimental to both individuals involved. There is a profound truth in the understanding that not all relationships are meant to endure the test of time, and recognizing when it's time to release someone from our lives is an important part of walking in alignment with God's plan. The clear sign that God is telling us to let go often comes when we sense that the relationship is causing more harm than good, and it is no longer serving its intended purpose. It should never appear that way. At the core of every relationship is the potential for mutual growth, understanding, and care. However, when we repeatedly find ourselves in situations where the relationship no longer produces any fruit, when it leads to emotional, spiritual, or physical depletion rather than enrichment, we are called to examine whether it is time to move on. Relationships, like everything else in our lives, are meant to be aligned with God's greater purpose. If the relationship no longer serves to encourage each individual to become more like Christ, or leads them toward deeper understanding and love, it becomes clear that God may be calling us to release it. This recognition is often accompanied by a deep, unsettling awareness that the relationship is no longer adding value to either person's life. It could manifest as a sense of stagnation, where no one is growing or progressing, or perhaps it is a consistent cycle of hurt and frustration that is never resolved. When such patterns emerge, it becomes evident that the relationship has reached a point where both individuals are unable to evolve or contribute meaningfully to one another's lives. In such moments, letting go is not a sign of failure, but a form of maturity and wisdom. It takes courage to acknowledge that it is better for both people to separate than to continue down a path that is spiritually, emotionally, or physically draining. We hold on to relationships because of fear of loneliness, fear of hurting someone, or fear of what others might think. But God's love is not confined to our fears. He calls us to act with integrity and courage. Letting go of someone is not a rejection of them as a person. It is an acceptance that this particular connection is no longer in alignment with the greater good that God desires for both individuals. Trusting that God will guide both parties on separate paths that will ultimately lead to their fulfillment is an essential part of trusting His plan. The recognition that a relationship has run its course is not an abandonment of love or care. It is a reflection of the understanding that love, at times, means allowing space for healing and growth. There may be a time when both individuals need to step back, to focus on themselves, and to allow God to do the work that needs to be done in each of their lives. The relationship may have fulfilled its purpose, whether in teaching valuable lessons, bringing certain experiences to light, or simply being a chapter in life that has now come to an end. God works in seasons, and He knows when it's time for certain relationships to evolve or come to a close. When we release someone from our lives, we free ourselves to move forward in the direction God has planned for us. This does not mean that the relationship was not valuable or that it was not meaningful. Sometimes God uses relationships to shape us and prepare us for what lies ahead. However, when it's time to let go, it is a testament to our trust in God's timing and wisdom. By letting go, we open ourselves to the possibility of new, healthier relationships that will contribute to our spiritual growth, fulfillment, and joy, aligning us more closely with God's divine purpose for our lives. One of the most powerful and transformative aspects of following God's guidance is the ability to trust His voice in our lives, especially when it comes to relationships. We often think that we can manage relationships on our own, relying on our own wisdom or feelings. However, God calls us to a deeper level of discernment, one that allows us to listen to the promptings of the Holy Spirit and the peace that He offers when we make decisions. Trusting God's voice in letting go of someone is not simply a matter of logic or human reasoning. It is about tuning into His divine wisdom, which surpasses all understanding. When God is telling us to release someone, we often experience a profound inner knowing, a sense of peace or unease that cannot be ignored. This is the Holy Spirit speaking to our hearts, guiding us toward the actions that align with His will. At times, we may question these feelings, especially when we have invested a great deal of time or emotion into the relationship. We may struggle with the idea of walking away, either because we fear the consequences, feel guilty, or because we simply do not want to face the emotional challenges of separation. However, trusting God's voice means surrendering to His perfect wisdom and understanding that His guidance is always for our good. God's wisdom does not always align with what we want in the moment. He calls us to make decisions that may seem difficult or painful, but they are ultimately for our growth, well-being, and His greater purpose for our lives. When we trust God in these moments, we open ourselves to the possibility of healing, renewal, and clarity that can only come from Him. Often, we must let go of the familiar, even when it feels uncomfortable, because God has something greater in store for us, something that requires space and freedom to fully unfold. His guidance is not about punishment or rejection, but about leading us into a place of greater peace and fulfillment.